This is my presentation for the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For starters, I'm going to give some background information on the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This occurred on August 6, 1945, and caused huge devastation to the Tokyo area of Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This event changed the course of history because now most world powers have a nuclear weapon at their disposal. They can wipe out. We could all be wiped out in a matter of hours if somebody launched a nuke. All right, with the background out of the way, let me discuss the first artifact. Artifact 1 is a New York Times article covering how some of the Japanese individuals survived the atomic bomb, who saw many tragedies and horrors because of the bombs and all of the damage that they cause. Some of the tragedies describe many different people, like one person described their brother having first-degree burns all over their body because as a result of being next to the bombs. And another portion of the artifact describes a man who burst in tears just describing a dead mother with a baby still suckling on her breast, as both of them died during these horrible events. So it really is just about the survivors talking about how the horrible experience with the nuclear weapons and how they affected their lives and how they still affect their lives with the conditions that some of them still carry. Many had burns and scars all over their bodies from this event and were scarred for the rest of their lives. Also, many were described as having very vivid cases of PTSD from the tragedies they experienced. With that, I will transition over to my second artifact. Artifact 2 is about the experiences of two pilots who helped drop the bombs on Hiroshima. These pilots are Claude Eatherly and Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr. Both had very conflicting viewpoints on how the bombs affected them. Claude Eatherly has stated that he still has nightmares to this day because of what happened and what he caused. He goes far as to say that this haunts him for the rest of his life and the guilt he feels is unimaginable. Another key testimony by Claude Eatherly is about the Promethean Gap and how no man should ever have the power that he experienced when dropping that bomb. I truly don't believe Claude Eatherly knew of what he was doing and the amount of destruction that these bombs would cause. On the flip side, Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr. says that he has never lost a night's sleep over this because it was never in his hands, it was in the hands of the United States government and the many people above him. He feels that he never actually made the decision that there's no weight on his conscience because it was the United States government that decided to do this. So with that, I'm going to translate to the case comparison. Both artifacts are very similar and different for very many different aspects. On the one side, both have a very anti-nuclear cause, yet they are still very different for obvious reasons. For starters, they're on totally opposite ends. I mean, for sakes, Claude Eatherly and Paul Tibbets are the ones who dropped the bombs, while the poor Japanese survivors are the ones who had to experience the tragedies because of those bombs being dropped. But once again, I mean, there are similarities too because of the obvious advocation against nuclear bombs. And in both artifacts, they describe a very intense trauma, except for Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr., who probably doesn't even have a conscience, obviously. But jokes aside, both do experience extreme trauma. One for the guilt that he feels, and the others for the situations that were put in because of the dropping of the bomb. And now I can also discuss the audience of both artifacts. The first one, I think they're speaking to most of the children that are the generations after World War II to continue to share the stories of the tragedies that are atomic weapons and nuclear weapons later on. And also, it could just be anyone that doesn't understand the perilous and the tragedies and the awareness of atomic. And that also kind of coincides with the second artifact too, as it also preaches an anti-nuclearist agenda. So, as I said, I feel like both artifacts kind of preach to the same audience of the anti-nuclearist agenda. But also with that, in the second artifact, you get the feeling that Colonel Paul Tibbets taking a shot at the U.S. government and kind of trying to spread awareness for you shouldn't trust everything you hear from the authority. It's kind of a side piece and not as important as the testimony of Claude Eatherly. All right, now our favorite part, getting into the rhetorical appeals compared and contrasted. So the biggest rhetorical appeal apparent in both of these is pathos. This is due to the emotional testimonies given in both artifacts. Although being very different testimonies, both have a very emotional impact on people. In the first artifact, the Japanese survivors used pathos frequently throughout they play on the audience's emotions by using many different imageries to convey emotion from people. This is done very well through the tragedies that they describe. And you have to be a psychopath pretty much not to feel any emotion from the powerful testimonies given by these Japanese individuals. Whereas in Artifact 2, Claude Eatherly almost uses if you understand the amount of turmoil and guilt he feels for his decisions. You know the burden and the guilt and the anger he feels for what he did. The audience is obviously going to resonate with this, as they themselves do not want this guilt, so it really helps translate to the anti-nuclearist movement. Next up is ethos. Both prove their credibility through bringing survivors of the event and aggressors. It's pretty hard to argue the Japanese credibility as they were the ones who went through the same thing with the United States troops who dropped the bombs. And the logos for both would be as followed for all the death and tragedy that was caused by these. There was 100,000 dead at Hiroshima, rough estimates. So this pretty much confirms the Japanese experience, the death and destruction that was caused. Everybody knows about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not everybody knows about the stories of these people. As with Artifact 2, Ether uses his first-hand experiences and knowledge of flying planes to describe to the audience to make himself seem more credible. It's really hard to disprove his credibility. Unfortunately, there's not very much logos for Artifact 2 because it really goes hand-in-hand with the ethos in this particular situation. Now on to the last rhetorical appeal of Kairos. In Artifact 1, the Japanese are actually from the Hiroshima, where the bombs were dropped. So they were ironically at the wrong place at the wrong time, but at the right place at the right time to give this interview. While on the flip side, in the second artifact, Claude Eatherly set up the interview with the reporter because he felt it was time to help with the anti-nuclear movement and to use his voice to let everybody know that these things really affected him and they would affect and understand the horror and guilt that he feels. I think a lot of the similarities in rhetorical choice due to the similarities of what they are striving to do, which is motivate people to move towards disarmament of nuclear weapons. While the inherent differences are based on both sides being on opposite ends, one being the bombers, the others being the ones unfortunately bombed. This concludes my presentation.